ID and
Okay.
start it up.
Okay, today is November 6th, 1990, and I'm Sandra Bendayan here at the Holocaust Library, doing part 2 of an interview with Ernest Glaser for the Oral History Project. And as I recall, we had left off pretty much where you were in high school. You were going to a school with a socialist point of view, I gather. And what was life like for you?
The school was I think I mentioned that, a school for Jews, not a Jewish school, even though it called itself a Jewish school. The point I'm making here is it was not a religiously oriented school, but all the students and I believe all the teachers were Jewish. It was a school which was upper middle class, upper middle class, and in some ways at the income level that my parents were at that point. I was on the low end. My family was on the low end of the income scale within the school. Some kids were brought to school with chauffeurs and very fancy cars. So it was located in Grunewald, which is a quite well-to-do neighborhood on the periphery of the city, in a park-like environment. School was an old estate that had been converted to a school. And interestingly enough, about 15 years ago or so, I was in Berlin, and I went out to look at the old school, and it is now a part of the Free University of Berlin, and there's no plaque or anything around there. It was on a weekend, so it was closed, but there was no identification that this used to be a private school at one time, a Jewish school. The school brings back a lot of memories to me, and talking about it. One of them relates to how we as kids related to Israel. Of course, Israel was Palestine at the time, under the British occupation or mandate. And there was, to a certain extent, the feeling throughout the student body that a goodly number of us would wind up in Israel as what we called on Hashara, which would be the kibbutz, to first learn agriculture in one of the farms in Germany. There were training farms available that you were sent to if you so decided to go and your parents let you, which was in a middle-class Jewish environment in Germany not really the thing to do. And my parents certainly were not Zionist. But the fondest memory I have is on weekends, on Fridays. I believe it was right after the noon recess, about 1 or 2 in the afternoon before we went home. We had an assembly every Friday in which we learned Hebrew songs, and we really got the identification with the Jewish people in Israel, in Palestine at the time. And at the end of it, everybody got a Jaffa orange. And oranges were extremely rare, especially Jaffa oranges were not on the market, because in Germany at the time, we only had the Italian oranges. They were much different from the Jaffa orange. And the teachers certainly got the point across to me, and I'm sure to the other kids as well, as to the identification of the country with this fruit. And it was the same kind of thing with which we are greeting the new year now with eating honey and bread. This is sweet year. It's the whole concept taken really out of the Jewish tradition. We also had each of us a tiny plot in the back of the school that was ours, and we had to till with vegetables or plant vegetables. I don't remember what it was, but every afternoon we had to go out there and pull the weeds, and I'm still doing that today, so things haven't changed a hell of a lot.
This was part of your agricultural training?
No, this was just part of being in the school. The school was there is no real equivalent, as I know it, in the American school system, because the kids in Europe are classified right at a very early age into the direction that they will ultimately go, whether it will be academic or it will be a business life, or whether they will be just a workman. So those that are in the European tradition, at least at the time, I don't know how it is today, were not slated to go on to any higher level of education, would go to age 14 and then go into some kind of an apprenticeship program to become craftsmen of one kind or another. Whereas there is on the other end of the spectrum, you have the gymnasium, which is really taking the kids up to 18 years of age, which really includes essentially 2 years, the first 2 years in college here. That was very much pitched toward the academic life, people going on to the liberal arts, or even going into law or the medical profession. In that extreme, you would learn Latin and Greek first, and then a foreign language. I went to what they call a Realgymnasium, which kind of translates into a more practical gymnasium, and we didn't learn the classical languages, although they were offered, but they were not the core curriculum. Instead, we learned English and French, 6 years of French and 3 years of English. English was very important in our school for obvious reasons. We were all in the process of transition. It was obviously a time that everyone knew we will probably not grow up in Germany, and we will have to find our way around the world with a different language.
Why did you feel that you wouldn't grow up in Germany?
Because the times were such that it was pretty obvious that if my parents didn't know it, at least those people that were in the educational system knew it. And if nothing else, it was an insurance program.
You didn't learn Hebrew then, though.
Hebrew was not taught again, the crazy situation. Hebrew was not taught as a language, as I recall. It was in Hebrew, an enrichment program in the afternoon for bar mitzvah. There was no bat mitzvah, it was all bar mitzvah. But our school was affiliated with the Oxford University. Oxford University, or was it Cambridge? I don't remember which of the two. Both of them had a matriculation, which is a high school program, which allowed direct entrance into the university from the high school, provided you passed that high school exam. And we were prepared and we were accredited. Our school was accredited. Some people came over from England to work with the school principals and so on, that the teaching program was on par with what they were teaching over there. So we were given a very good grounding in not only German literature but English literature, as an example. Teaching much more Shakespeare than you would normally find, for instance, in a German school, or Chaucer, or any one of those classical English authors, all geared for us to ultimately, if not go to England, then to be able to use this matriculation paper anywhere within the English world as a stepping stone. And that was something that was very important for all of us. I wasn't a very good student. As a matter of fact, I was a bum student. But I recall the difference in attitude that I had vis-a-vis English and the French. The French that was taught 6 years never stuck. To this day, my French is almost non-existent. But English was taught in a practical way, and it was taught in a way that was very unique. Really, the language was taught on the basis of idioms rather than grammar. And conversational English was much, much more important for at least the first year than all the reading material. And we spent long hours practicing English in conversation with each other and with the teacher. So we had this orientation, and I'm sure that part of this also tied in with the fact that Israel was under the British mandate, because again, even if we go to Israel or to Palestine, the English matriculation would be of value to us. The social life that we had after hours was, well, it was in good part, in good measure, related to where we lived. The school drew on a very large geographic area. As I mentioned, a lot of the kids were chauffeured in or took I took public transportation and took the streetcar every day, or the bicycle. And it was about 20 minutes, half hour from where I lived. So these were not neighborhood friends. Some of them lived in a neighborhood, and we got together. But friendships were primarily at the school, and we didn't visit each other's houses too much. However, I had a goodly number of friends that lived in my own neighborhood, that I went to grammar school with, that I grew up with, and we stuck together, although we went different paths. We didn't all go to the same school. As a matter of fact, none of them went to my school. One of them, he's still a very good friend of mine, lives in Washington, D.C. today. This is my oldest friend, really, a man that I went to grammar school with, and I believe even to kindergarten before that. We had a tight nucleus of about 8 or 9 boys, and we were all a part of a little club that was semi-private. I mean, it was all private, but what I mean by this is it was really the parents getting together, and there was a Jewish bachelor teacher who was retired, who put together a boys' club, essentially, and we went practically every afternoon over to his place, and he was a man who was able to involve us in an awful lot of different things, collecting stamps, playing chess, building model airplanes, things that attract boys and really mold character. It was kind of an indoor Boy Scout organization, if that makes any sense. Although we did have on weekends a number of trips away from Berlin even. We went to important places to visit, museums and so on. And I remember one Easter vacation we spent in Czechoslovakia for about 10 days, 2 weeks, just up in the snow country, hiking through the snow, skiing. We didn't do any skiing, but it was a lot of fun, and we had really a great time at about 15 boys and this one teacher, that was all.
So your parents could afford that kind of an excursion?
They must have, but I'm sure it was at a sacrifice because their income was limited at the time. The other thing that my parents were very intent on exposing me to as many experiences as possible. They also, another thing that they paid for was for me to be able to join a tennis club and have private tennis lessons, a Jewish tennis club, which I enjoyed. I was very poor at it, but I enjoyed a great deal. And the other thing that was bad investment on the part of my parents was they had it in their mind that every kid has to be able to play some instrument. And playing the mandolin, they thought, would be a very social kind of a thing, you know. Obviously, they predated the advent of the guitar in this country, but the idea, since we were going out hiking, and hiking is a big thing in Europe, here you can always have a guitar strung over your back and take it. I mean, a mandolin is not a big instrument to take along and be part of the entertainment. That I guess they were acting out their own dreams that they had, you know. I was a lousy mandolinist, I'll tell you that. And we had a man come over, I guess, once a week or so, until he finally gave up the ghost and said that this is a hopeless proposition. But it did stick a little bit, not the playing of the mandolin, but my interest in music. So I was far from having a deprived childhood. It was a very varied experience. A lot of interaction with non-Jewish kids in the neighborhood. I think I've mentioned in the past that we were playing in the street together, and even as we were getting older, we didn't really get into each other's way. At least one or two fellows that were about my age, maybe one of them was a little older, who regarded me as a friend, in spite of the fact that they were in the Hitler Youth and they went through the whole thing, and we only really drifted apart when we were about 16 or 17 because they moved away. That was one of the reasons. So you also talked about my relatives, and you wanted me to talk a little bit about my relatives. I don't know whether or not I mentioned it. This is an episode which is kind of interesting. My aunt married, my Aunt Hannah married before World War I, I believe. Her husband was killed during the war. She was a war widow. Had 3 sons. Fritz, the first one, let's see, Fritz was the oldest one. Kurt was the second oldest, I believe, and Willie the youngest. And my father was a very important part of their upbringing because there was no other man in the house, obviously. My aunt and the three boys lived with my grandmother as long as she was alive. Fritz was a story that I want to talk about because at least at the time he was my hero, and very much romanticized all through my life until only a few years ago when he visited and we talked about it, and he didn't quite set me straight, but he disabused me a little bit of my romantic ideas. But the way I remember the story and romanticized it was that this fellow was somehow involved in some political activity right prior to Hitler's getting into power. And in 1933 or 34, he had to flee the country and went to France, where he was, of course, an illegal immigrant, and went to Lyon in the south of France, where he learned the trade. I think he already had learned the trade of being a shirt maker, tailored shirt maker. I fell in love with a daughter of the man that employed him. He had a very winning personality. He, on a weekend, borrowed the car to take out the young lady and wrecked the car and was afraid that the police would get him, and fled the country to North Africa to join the Foreign Legion. And from the Foreign Legion, he was in there for a few months and couldn't take it. And he was one of the few that escaped from the Foreign Legion to go to Canary Islands. Worked his way on a tramp steamer to Constantinople. And one fine day, around 1936 or 37, the telephone rings, and my father answered the phone, and he says, "What the hell are you doing in Berlin?" It was my cousin Fritz, who had smuggled himself back to Berlin, penniless, without a coat, in the middle of winter, because his girlfriend, from way back when, lived in Berlin, and he wanted to marry her and go to South America with her. And my father and I going to the train station and picking him up there with a overcoat over the arm. And the danger was that the Gestapo would pick him up because he, first of all, looked like a bum, and secondly, was without any papers. Somehow my parents were able, and others, I guess, were able to get him booking on a steamer to go to Uruguay, where he lived and died not too long ago. But he had visited his brothers here, and
Did he marry the girl?
He married the gal, not for very long, but he went into the shirt business in Uruguay, in Montevideo. So this kind of a vignette of kind of an unusual story, because those things only happen in times of crazy stress, and I guess they still happen today.
Were your parents fearful in that period too? Like you said, 37.
My parents, well, fearful depends on how you define that. Fearful for their lives, I would say not really. Fearful of repercussions for not doing something that the regime wanted them to do, sure. I think I may have mentioned it, that whenever they answered the telephone, whenever there was a conversation that was kind of sticky in the house, they would unplug the telephone thinking that it may be tapped. That became a habit. But I think many Jewish families did that. There was a good deal of apprehension about the future. my father, knowing this business associate that was really extremely helpful to him, felt perhaps a little bit safer, at least felt that he would be forewarned in case of any problems. But what to anticipate, nobody knew.
But I guess they felt maybe they could live it out. Whatever.
Absolutely. Absolutely. To the last day, they were either felt that or were told that. And when we were at the train station, people taking us to the train station said, well, "You're crazy leaving. This is going to blow over." And this was in June of '39.
June of '39.
Yeah. So the social environment that I grew up with was in many ways more important than the religious environment. From a religious standpoint, I don't remember what I talked about going through Bar Mitzvah
Yes,
and being close to the rabbi, and that perhaps made a big impression on me than any teaching that I had as such, because it didn't really stick, as far as I recall.
Also, your parents weren't pressing you for any
No,
of these things. So.
not at all. My parents were responding, were really reacting rather than proacting. My parents were, when I became interested in religious services, my father would come with me to the synagogue or would have Shabbat services. And except for the Hanukkah observation, that was a big thing because it really replaced the Christmas observation that was all around us. I don't recall that we had any, in our home at least, any great Purim observation. We did have, not in our home, or maybe once or twice, Passover services. We did go to Passover every year within the family, and that was something that was looked upon as kind of a enjoyable chore. On the one hand, most of the time we went to my mother's side. I think every time, I can't remember ever being at a Passover Seder on with my father's relatives, who were much less observant than my mother's relatives, and they weren't that observant. But there was a great uncle of mine who was very knowledgeable, let's say. Not that my father wasn't knowledgeable, but he didn't want to do it. But this man was very knowledgeable. Everybody enjoyed his service, except that it lasted forever, and being young and easily bored, and I was together on those observations always with my cousin, and I want to talk about that a little bit. I don't know whether I mentioned my uncle marrying out of the faith, and he they had a daughter who is about 2 years younger than I am, lives in South Africa now. We spent